We've been refining the system for decades, but what if it's time to redesign it? Not from scratch, but from what we know works. You're listening to Education by Design. I'm your host, Phil Evans. In this episode, our guest is Richard Hood, an educator and professional learning facilitator who champions creativity, inquiry, and a joy in education. We'll discuss the shift from content delivery to helping kids find their excitement, the role of joy in professional learning, and how technology media shapes modern classrooms. Richard, could you briefly share with us what were some of the light bulb moments that shaped your philosophy of teaching?
Education's a journey for me. It's been a long journey. I've known that I was meant to be a teacher my whole life. It took me a while to get there. But having got there, I worked at the Royal Ontario Museum for the first year before I went into a school. And I loved that. We're teaching in the galleries and with Roman marble busts and all this dinosaurs and gems. What's not to love, right? And then when I went to my first classroom at Upper Canada College, I said, well, you know what? I just learned so many great things. My job here is to tell all these kids what I learned. So I spent about 2 years doing that, and then I thought, wait a minute, that doesn't feel good. That can't be right. So at that point, I started to question about inquiry. So I had that experience at the museum, which was transformative for me. I loved every second of it. And so I think my mind shifted from what am I excited about to how do I help kids find their excitement? And that took about 3 years, sad to say, for those kids. But that's been an interesting journey. And I think as that's gone on, I've been pleased and actually proud of the IB, that my early experiences as an IB teacher was very much, we were preparing kids for exams, and that was very clear, and our parent community, that's what they wanted. They wanted kids to do well on exams. And I never felt completely comfortable with that, and now I'm perhaps more uncomfortable with that than I was even then. So that's been a bit of a journey, and I think what I would say about myself now is, and my understanding of education, is that the victory in education is in the process. It's in the struggle. The end will be the end. It will be varied and differentiated for every kid who goes through a classroom, but that's what you honor. That's where the struggle is.
I love that. In what way do you feel that traditional notions of rigor limit both teachers and students?
Well, it's a very complex question, isn't it? What does rigor mean? Rigor, I think in the past has presupposed that there is a right answer, and that an appropriate amount of rigor, like cod liver oil, will bring you to this right answer. And external assessment kind of supports that myth, that there are going to be examiners who are going to be looking at what you write and seeing if it fits with their version or an accepted version of the truth about this novel or this mathematical theorem or whatever. And I think the world now is too complex. I think just to honor the complexity of the world, we need to understand that there's many different ways to get at it.
I think you make a really good point there, and I think there's just so much that we can do to support teachers to feel as though they can really help students to see those multiple inroads to their learning. Mm-hmm. So how does giving students agency transform the role of the teacher from manager into listener?
Our notion of who and what is an educator is really being turned on its head. And this is not a new thing. I mean, John Dewey was writing about this many, many years ago. Vygotsky was writing about this. So it's not new. We're rediscovering, I think, best practice in the context of our age. And I think it's perhaps more, it's more serious now because the problems, the really complex problems that we're facing in the world have gotten more complex and more serious. So they're talking about, a climate emergency. And I think that just in terms of the pedagogy, the practice of education, we all know that it's possible to... Teachers graduate from university in a discipline at the diploma level anyway. And so when they think about teaching, they think about, okay, here's what I know, here's what I learned, and here's what the kids need to know, because here's the assessments that they're going to be dealing with. And that's part of rigor. I get that. I mean, I've been an examiner for 20, 25 years in the IB, so I get that that's important. I really do. Is it the most important? I guess that's the question.
I agree, that certainly is a very good question. So let's come back to the role of the teacher.
John Hattie has this notion of feedback, the Australian researcher. And our common notion of feedback is what we give kids. They need feedback from us. And that's true. But he says, no. The most important feedback you get in a classroom is from the students to you, because they're telling you what their learning needs are. So what does that mean for our dispositions as teachers? Well, one of the things it means is we need to listen. We need to listen to what kids are telling us about their learning needs. We need to, I don't use the term teacher anymore, to be honest. I call myself as an educator a diagnostician. And what am I diagnosing? I'm diagnosing student learning needs. How am I going to find out what they need? By listening to what they do. I think the other thing that's really important is, and again, I'm speaking from just in my own career, I feel like for many, many years of my career, I felt like my job was to manage the classroom. And of course that is part of your job, but it's not most of your job. So here's my thinking now. The bulk of my job is to create learning engagements for kids that are invitational, that let them know that I understand their world and I'm inviting them to bring that world into the classroom, that it's authentic. And if I can create learning engagements, if most of my energy goes into that, and let those be the engines that move the class forward, my job doesn't become to manage the classroom. My job becomes to listen to what people are saying, to seeing how they're making meaning of whether it's Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice or whether it's a theorem in mathematics. How are you making meaning of that? And it's only that meaning, it's the multiplicity of those meanings that co-author our understanding of whatever topic it is we're talking about in the classroom. So I think that my view of teaching now is, what's the goal? If I'm spending a year in a classroom with kids, what would be my goal at the end of that? I think my goal would be to say two things at the end. One, I watched you develop a toolkit where you now can do what you couldn't do before. Number two is that I heard your voice. You matter. And in my relationship with you over the course of this year, I showed you that you matter. And that while you may, where the self-talk you have in your head might suggest from your cultural context that you actually don't matter. You may come from poverty. You may come from a dysfunctional household. You may come from food insecurity. You may come from a lot of very difficult, traumatic places. And the feedback loop in your own head can be very much, I don't matter. And the world is not a very friendly place. And so if in our classroom we can change that narrative, and it's a bit arrogant, I think, to say that we can change that narrative, but what we can do is help students see alternatives. Begin, at least, to say, that's not the only narrative that I can have. And that, to me, would be, those two outcomes would be a pretty fantastic way to end a year.
I'll say it certainly puts a different spin on the whole concept of an outcome, doesn't it? I'd like to ask you what you see teachers experiencing when they first realize that there's more open, inquiry-based approaches to teaching.
Yeah. No, there a couple of phrases pop to mind on that. One is existential angst. There is this notion of whoa, and then allied with that a little bit, there's the notion of freedom, but I call it a terrible freedom. It's a freedom to reimagine what education can be, but it's terrible in the sense that what does that mean? What does that look like? How does it get played out in the real world instead of just a conversation like the one we're having here? So I think this angst and freedom can be, in my experience with, particularly in the workshops, can be overwhelming. People just get a sense of, wait a minute, that's not how I learned. That's not how I was taught. I read about it. It's not like I don't know about it, but my administrators, when they talk to me about how things are going, they're worried about standardized tests. They're worried about the reputation of the school, their reputation. They're worried about how we're getting along as a faculty. So there's kind of layers on layers there. I think that for many faculty that I've been involved with, there's kind of a St. Paul on the road to Damascus experience as well, where you're just walking along and you're doing your thing, and then boom, something comes along and it like changes everything. And so when everything changes, you're in this kind of transition mode, aren't you? This is where you've spent your career, with maybe little forays into inquiry-based learning or concept-based education, or using the words learning engagement instead of assignment or exercise or homework. The language matters, right?
It does.
So there's a sense of, okay, there's the opportunity for change here, there's the invitation to change here. And one of the learner profile characteristics is a risk taker. I don't like that framing of that. What it's really talking about is courage, right? And so I think this new curriculum, this new invitation to think about the way we teach, it gives the opportunity for courage, and courage can take a while to develop. It can take a while to find the route to be courageous, where you can still please everybody who you need to please, but honor the learning needs of your kids in the classroom at the same time.
And honor the kids at the same time. That's beautiful. I just think about when I talk to teachers who, like me, we were trained to be literature teachers. And, when you come into a language and literature, you're sort of a more modernized curriculum where we're sort of looking at all kinds of different text types. It can be threatening that you have to teach, a podcast or a political cartoon or film as text. So I can identify with this fear that I see teachers sort of go through.
Yeah.
And I think it's about creating those safe spaces where that fear and that vulnerability can be normalized.
Teachers in schools don't get much time for many professional conversations that are inspiring, that give them a vision of moving forward instead of just repeating the same old. So I think in many workshops that I've been privileged to be a part of, we find a place of inspiration. And then the question then becomes one of sustainability. So how do we take that inspiration, that vision of what I think the Lang and Lit for All, the equity, the helping kids find their voice, how do we take that vision and let it live in a sustainable way in our school, in my classroom, with my colleagues? And my argument around that sustainability is that it's almost impossible to do on your own. It really is. So you need to find a group of like-minded people, colleagues, to say, this is what we value. We can do all the stuff around content, like we've all got our degrees, blah, blah. So what does it mean for us to become expert practitioners at understanding what kids need in a way that allows them to find a place where they can cultivate their own voice.
And a greater sense of wondering, right?
Yeah, wondering, yeah. And I'm a big fan of awe and wonder. And it's we all know this, and I think we could all, anybody in this chair could say this, but we all know kids. I've got grandkids. They're 6, and their question is why. Everything is why. And when they come up to the lake where my cottage is, it's the best thing we can do is get wood, get saws, and make something, and let it float or let it sink or whatever. But whatever happens, happens. So there's this notion that we enter into a world and we ask questions about it, and then we wonder about it. And the wonder is the thing that moves us to inquire. The thing about the research on concepts is pretty clear. It's that they allow for transfer from one subject to another, from one novel to another. And what's being transferred? Well, there's an understanding that's being transferred. There are questions that are being transferred. There's context that's being transferred. And there's a toolkit that's being transferred. So if we talk about the concept of violence in a book like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and then the next class is where kids go into history and they're talking about a revolution, or that concept transfers over, and it allows them to make connections that they wouldn't have made had they not understood the concept of violence and how complex that can be, and how it acts as a window to understanding in different subjects. So things like the ability to think conceptually, that doesn't come naturally, I don't think. So there has to be some work that we would do, and again, I would structure learning engagements around this, where we understand what a concept is, first of all, like what is it, and then why is it helpful, or how is it helpful, what are its limitations, and that's really what that is. It's inquiry-based learning, isn't it? It's taking a thing and subjecting it to an interrogation. And so when we've talked a little bit about teaching. One of the big concepts, I think, for teachers, for diagnosticians, is the notion of curiosity. How do we model, and you and I have talked about this, about modeling, how do we model curiosity for students? They're not necessarily curious about what we're curious about. So how do we understand, first of all, what they're curious about, and then create learning engagements where they are able to say, I'm curious about this because it's freaking awesome. It excites me, whether it's a song lyric or an advertisement or something in their daily life, was walking down a street or watching cars travel, or thinking about anything that they would think about. Whatever they bring in their life to the classroom can be part of awe and wonder. And that's where I think we start. So many teachers, we've talked about a notion called do it now, which is a little 3 to 4 minute thing at the beginning of a class where you just interrogate where people have come from in that day so far. How was your chemistry test? Did you make the football team? How's the play going? The yearbook, or what stage just like what are they bringing into the classroom? The notion of, there's a website I look at called the Center for Playful Inquiry, which is great because it takes play and looks at that as the basis of inquiry. Play, and I would argue curiosity as well.
Now we're really getting to something that I feel is the essence of what makes a learning environment different from a traditional schooling environment.
Sure.
And that's joy.
I know people who, if you talked about what made them joyful, they would say engines. I love engines. I love tinkering with engines, right? Not my shtick, but they love it. My son-in-law is a good example. He loves engines. So we're getting onto the notion of differentiation here, that all education, to be joyful, needs to have multiple access points.
Right.
Because if there's 25, 30, 35 kids in our class, they're not all going to have the same notion of fun.
So true.
And if we believe fun and joy is important, there's a thing that I just discovered about 2 months ago, the concept of joy snacks.
Joy snacks.
Joy snacks.
Oh, I like that.
And so what it is you'd be going along doing whatever, and you say, stop, time out, we're going to have a joy snack. And whatever that means, it might be a cartoon, it might be what's the latest song we're thinking about, and can someone play a bit of it? Something that brings joy and reminds us that that's the purpose of why we're here, to share joy together in our learning. And that it doesn't change and transformation can be incredibly threatening, especially for an adolescent who doesn't even know who they are, who didn't make the football team, whose face has acne, like whatever, and they're saying, my sense of a kid's prayer when they open the front door of the school is always, please don't let me be embarrassed in front of my peers today. So that's the kind of hold that they want in their life at that point. I do not want to be embarrassed because I'm not sure of who I am.
Richard, you're making me think about how formative those years were and how, how much I did think about what other people thought of me. The shaping of identity is not just something that happens socially. It's something that can really be impacted by the experiences that we have in the classroom. Can you think of other examples where you've worked with schools and this has become a theme?
I was consulting with a school in Georgia. It's a rural school. Very poverty-stricken. Kids had no food security at home. They served 3 meals a day at the school. The notion that a student was going to go home to a room where they had a computer, where they had the internet, was laughable. All that stuff had to be at the school because it just wasn't anywhere else. And so we were talking about identity, and I felt, here I am, a white male, consulting with a poverty-stricken school in Georgia, and I said to myself, what do I have to offer these folks who I care very much about? I care about their educational journey, I care about their kids, but I feel like a bit of an imposter in this relationship. And so we talked about identity, and it was a way to try and to just get back to your concept idea, this notion of identity. And we were talking about how we engage kids, because they come from places where necessarily they don't get the game of school. School, for some kids, is a game that they're very good at. Right. And they learn very quickly how to play, to please the teacher, to get an A, to do this, to do that. And those kids are enfranchised. They're often enfranchised by wealth, by parents who give them what they need to be successful. But these other kids have, I think, and we've talked about this a little bit, a kind of a playback loop that might say something like, I don't get the game of school, and not only that, I don't think people care that I don't get the game of school. So we're talking about this with this school in Georgia, so we talked about how do you engage your kids in the game of school? And one guy said, I'll never forget this. He said, I talk about their shoes. I ask them about their shoes.
Yeah.
And I realized as soon as he said that, and then he went on to say, the kids I teach care about their kicks, whether it's Jordan's or whether it's James or whoever it is, their identity is tied to that. And so that's where we start. Where do they feel like they belong? Now let's take that concept of belonging and work it into something where they feel they don't belong. That was for me, that was a transformational moment to hear that.
For sure. And, I get a sense that, this is something that's happening for us as adults as it's happening for students. I mean, everything's changing so quickly that, what we've had in the classroom, what we taught in the classroom, even when I started my teaching career, nearly 2 decades ago, that was just such a different world. And we have to completely change the way we think about the learning environment, about the students that we teach.
Yeah.
So the students are going through this as well as the teachers.
There's a good visible thinking routine from Harvard. I used to think, now I think everybody knows it. But it's a pretty powerful routine when you say, before I read this book or talked to this person or had this experience, here's what I believed. And now I can no longer believe that because of the experience I've just had. To me, that's what learning is. I can no longer believe that. So I've learned something that challenges my notion, perhaps of the way the world works or the way people are or the way I am. How do I make new meaning of that? What is that? What's the invitation there for me? Where's the joy of that?
Richard reminds us of just how challenging it can be to change the way we think about education and about the way that we engage others in learning. Yet our opportunity lies in community, in collaboration, in creativity, and working together to solve the problems and remove barriers to learning for students. Change can be hard, but it can also be exciting.
If you have to be able to be well yourself, to find a place where in all the injustice of the world, we feel like for whatever value it is, we can make a difference. Yeah. And sometimes that's a really small thing. Sometimes it's just an awareness. It can have many, many different iterations. But it's an important human thing to make a difference.
You've been listening to the Education by Design podcast. I've been your host, Phil Evans. If you like this episode, please hit subscribe or follow, and join me for my next episode. And until next time, keep on learning.